it used to be we had, the newspaper, the middle of the road, Walter Cronkite, right? So we had the middle of the road. And so even on diverging issues, there tended to always be this middle view that sort of tempered things. But now if you have very differing views, because they access the information, you never have to have a dialogue with anybody else. So you can watch a certain news program and only get that news, or you can watch another set of news programs and only get that news. And so there's some worry that in fact we become, not only is it distracted and skimmers, but that we become much more, given the level of access, we become much more sort of dogmatic in our views and less able to converse and have a dialogue.
Right. And I think we do see that. We see this polarization. And this is something that's been going on, since before the internet with talk radio and with cable news that increasingly, tries to appeal to a particular point of view. But again, this is an example of another example of how when you open up the floodgates of information, you don't necessarily get the effects you would expect. And so when the web was new and people started going online, one of the hopes was that suddenly, we'd expand our horizons and we'd suddenly have access to all these different points of view, and we'd explore, the opinions of people who didn't agree with us. And what's happened is the opposite in many cases, that and we should have probably foreseen this because it's kind of a flaw in human beings' makeup, is that we gravitate toward those people and those views that reinforce our pre-existing opinions and pre-existing biases. And so you're absolutely right that in many cases, what we've seen is you give people unlimited amounts of information and they just go in the one direction. They just seek out that information that reinforces their previous thinking. And, one thing that the science of this kind of information flow makes clear is that when that happens and people are just expose themselves to the points of view that essentially mimic their own, those points of view become more and more extreme over time, because you start to you get so much information that confirms your bias that you say, any other point of view must be wrong because look, I'm getting all these people are telling me that I'm right. And so you get more extreme views and you get more polarization, between the left and the right or between whatever. And what we've discovered is that's very hard. It's very hard to get people in general to seek out information that opposes what they already believe.
The tendency for us to seek confirming evidence. And when we think about businesses, this concern here is that businesses, in fact, will have that same tendency, and thus will make decisions and tie themselves to strategies in a way that sort of sets them on the road to ruin. So, so the fear is you're going to see more big failures because of companies will continue to seek confirming evidence. And you can even argue some of the financial crisis was kind of seeking confirming evidence because you have so much information to consume that we'll see more mistakes in that way.
Yeah, I think that even applies to what's come to be called big data in this, because it the assumption is, well, you have all this data, you have these algorithms that can sort through it and find correlations and so forth. It turns out that a lot comes down to the person who's looking at the data, and you can find all sorts of correlations in a big pile of data, and not all of them are actually, some of them are just coincidental, or, some of them will lead you in the wrong direction. So on the one hand, I think big data kind of analytics offers the opportunity to get some more objective feedback on your strategy, on your positioning or whatever, but it doesn't guarantee that. You can also, even looking at enormous pools of data, you can look at it in a biased way, and even that, you'll pull out the information that confirms your existing point of view about the market or whatever.
Terry, so we're at the Tuck School. If you're going to give advice to our graduating students, what advice would you give them around these issues?
The most important thing I'd say is that I think now that we all kind of carry smartphones and other constantly connected devices, powerful computers around in our pocket or our pocketbook or whatever, it's more important than ever to be conscious, to be aware of how the technology influences the way we think, the way we perceive things, the way we interact with other people. It becomes very easy when technology kind of gets a lot of momentum and becomes so dominant to simply say, this is just how I live, this is how other people live, and kind of allow the technology to become invisible. And there's a lot of big technology companies that really want the technology to become invisible, because once it becomes invisible, then you use it without thinking about it, which is their ideal. But I do think it's important just to be aware of how this is influencing you. And once you do that, I think you begin to realize that, in a lot of circumstances, whether it's at work or in your social life, it's great to have tons of information at your fingertips. And you want to have that stimulation of being able to exchange messages with other people all the time. But then there are also times when, if you want to, think in certain creative ways or big picture ways, it makes sense to slow down the flow of information, or even to stop it and say, I'm going to back away from this and actually listen to my own thoughts for a while without being interrupted. And so I think by kind of challenging yourself to think critically about your use of technology, you'll ultimately be able to have a more balanced life and a better balance in the ways you use your mind, the ways you interact with other people, rather than just going kind of in the direction that the technology tends to push us.